So last time we got Russia to the point where it was a European power through the selective use of westernization by Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. Both westernized more to enhance Russia's military power uh, over anything else. So they weren't as interested in organizing the government in a more efficient way, except that by organizing the government in a more efficient way, it would enhance the military power and the power of the czar. And so for that reason, they try not to change anything that they consider to be fundamentally Russian. And so the period that's going to follow is going to see the success of that policy. And so the Russians are going to come to believe that they have a superior approach to government and culture than that of Western Europe. The Western European approach is too individual focused and selfish, and that there's something particularly special about the Russian spirit that enables them to take the best parts of the West and reject the rest of it. So, what happens next is we have the French Revolution, and during that time, Alexander the First comes to the throne, and he is continuing in a lot of ways Catherine's westernizing reforms. But Alexander the First increasingly sees himself in messianic terms as this savior who had been sent to Europe to defeat Napoleon. And so while all the sources tell us that they got along fine personally, Alexander the First and Napoleon were at odds ideologically, and so the French revolutionary spirit embodied by Napoleon is opposed by this conservative spirit embodied by Alexander the First. So eventually Napoleon does invade Russia for really no good reason. The point was to uphold the continental system and to force the Russians to abide by other terms of the treaty that the two had signed at Friedland. And that's not really good enough to merit an invasion of a country like Russia. And so the French army actually reached what was more or less the border between areas of French control in Russia. And they had reached that point late enough that all of Napoleon's marshals, except one, urged him to stop and regroup there and then invade Russia the next year. And Napoleon had been right so often and his advisors wrong so often that he had also come to see himself in kind of messianic terms and pushes on with the disastrous results that we've talked about. And so when Napoleon is defeated, this just reinforces Alexander the First's view of himself as this person sent by God to put Europe on the right path, and more broadly reinforces the view of the Russian elite that their system was superior to that of the rest of Europe. As now, not only is Napoleon defeated in his invasion of Russia, but his forces are in such tatters that the nationalist backlash that occurs subsequently is more than Napoleon can fight off. So we end up with the defeat of Napoleon and then Russia playing a major role at the Congress of Vienna. Now it's at this point, though, that the British and to a lesser degree the French come to see Russia as potentially the new threat to the balance of power. And in the period that follows this, there were all kinds of accounts written in Europe that were hysterical about the size and expansion of Russia, often entitled things like the Russian juggernaut. So the Russians don't do anything at the Congress of Vienna to diminish these fears. At the Congress of Vienna, Russia claims as compensation for the primary role that it played in the defeat of Napoleon, Poland. And remember, Poland had been partitioned between Austria, Prussia, and the Russians, and so it had disappeared off the map. But a Duchy of Warsaw had been reconstructed by Napoleon, who led the Poles to believe that he was going to grant them independence at some point. And there were a lot of Polish soldiers that were among the best that Napoleon had, and that was part of the reason. They had come to look to France as kind of this big brother power that can get them what they need. And so not only is that new state going to be wiped off the map and absorbed into Russia, but Russia was claiming an even greater share of Poland than they had taken from the earlier expansion and partition of Poland. And this almost brings the great powers to war. Eventually, Russia is bought off / backs down. And so they end up taking over what was known as Congress Poland, a smaller version of Poland that was nominally independent of the rest of the Russian Empire. The Tsar of Russia was also the King of Poland. That fiction does not last long. In 1830, there's a revolution in Poland, crushed by the Russians, who then absorb it altogether. And so when we talk about somebody who's Polish from 1830 on, technically we're talking about somebody who was a subject of the Russian Empire. So there's that part of the great power dynamic, but on the other hand, Russia has emerged as one of the protectors of the conservative status quo. So one of the pushes at the Congress of Vienna was to assert conservatism at the expense of liberalism and nationalism. And Russia was very much on the forefront of this. So generally speaking, the Russians were strongly anti-revolution and were instrumental in aiding in the defeat of revolutionary movements throughout the 1820s. The one big exception, of course, is Greece. And here we already see kind of the different views that the Russians are going to take. So broadly speaking, the Russians are anti-revolution. They think that revolutions are elements of the French Revolution disease, and they want to crush them, unless those revolutions can help the Russians gain access to the Mediterranean. And then they're all for them. And so the Greek Revolution was an outlier because, one, it could help the Russians gain access to the Straits, potentially, and also to the Mediterranean. And two, it was a Christian versus Muslim conflict, at least in the eyes of Europeans. And so the Russians, along with the British and the French, support the Greek Revolution, which is successful in 1829. So there are already kind of the shakiness with the Concert of Europe. Now, at the core of the Concert of Europe was an alliance known as the Holy Alliance. And the Holy Alliance is, in theory, this alliance to assert Christian principles, which meant to assert Christian principles as interpreted in 1815, to protect Christian principles as articulated by conservatives at that time. And so it was, again, an anti-liberal type of alliance. Metternich, who was the foreign minister of Austria at that point, didn't take the Holy Alliance all that seriously. But the Holy Alliance, even though it wasn't technically applied, was de facto applied again and again and again, in that these three countries would support each other or would act together in order to suppress revolutions. And this was made especially clear in 1848, when Russia is once again the defender of conservatism, who helps to put down the revolutionary movements in the Austrian Empire. And the Russians, as a result of their role in 1848 in restoring order to Europe, their view, thought that the Austrians were in their debt. And so when the next conflict occurs in Europe, the Russians felt like they were betrayed by the Austrians, who at first announced that they were going to be neutral in the Crimean War, and then actually declare war on Russia in the Crimean War because they see the Russians expanding too much in the Balkans. And so the Crimean War is the end of the Concert of Europe, the end of the Holy Alliance, the end of this relationship in particular between Russia and Austria. And from this point on, so this is the 1850s, Russia and Austria are going to be in opposition to each other over what will happen to the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, what will happen in Southeastern Europe. Because the Russians see it as to their advantage to inspire nationalist movements in Southeastern Europe in a way as a way of encouraging pan-Slavism. And again, kind of in the overall strategic view of the Russians, this was a way of gaining control of the Straits or access to the Mediterranean. The Crimean War ends with Russia's defeat. So not only does it bring to an end the Holy Alliance and Concert of Europe. It also brings to an end this Russian ultra-conservatism where they suppress every type of reform. And so one example of this early suppression that occurred in that earlier revolutionary era was the suppression of the Decembrist uprising. The Decembrists were fairly moderate officers. By Russian standards, they were liberal, who just wanted a national legislature. And this is crushed and it's suppressed. And the Russians justify this kind of thing by saying that we have maintained order and stability by not allowing this kind of reform. This kind of reform is poison. Well, it's the Crimean War that finally shatters this Russian self-confidence, as they are defeated in their own backyard by the more technologically advanced Western Europeans. This passage is from a book on the Russian Revolution, and before the author gets into the Russian Revolution, he takes a look at these peasant households and what the peasant traditions were. And so one of the outcomes of the Crimean War is that Russia is going to choose to industrialize, but the czars recognize that in order to industrialize, they need to emancipate the serfs. They need to abolish serfdom. And so what this passage illustrates is just how conservative even that reform was. Technically, the serfs are emancipated, but as the passage points out, in reality, serfs couldn't move anywhere, at least not very easily. And so this kind of gets to the heart of what we're going to see in Russia over the second half of the 19th century. There are reforms, and some of those reforms bear fruit, but the Russians resist a more fundamental change to society. And by engaging in the kind of rhetoric that they engage in when they abolish serfdom, they actually encourage other reform movements. And so the kind of genie is let out of the bottle in that way, but the Russians refuse to make the more fundamental reforms like creating a legislature or granting the middle class real mobility and say in the government. They don't do any of those things. And so the pressure is building and building and building in Russia. In part, the radical movements are inspired by the rhetoric of the Tsarist government, which has opened up people to a lot of hope. But in addition to that, the radical movements are the product of industrialization. And so by clustering lots of people in cities, the Russians have kind of opened themselves to the same kind of revolutionary movements that we would see in Western Europe. And so while the Russians had earlier on congratulated themselves on avoiding the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 and thought it was the Russian system that had enabled them to do so, it was probably more the case that the Russian failure to industrialize had saved them from those kinds of revolutions. And so as Russia industrializes in the late 19th century, this creates the same forces for change in Russia that we would see elsewhere. You have workers who are working 12 to 14 hours a day in unsafe conditions for very low pay. They're unhappy. They're packed in cities, so it's easier for them to organize than before. You have the peasant situation that we've already described. Landless, poor, illiterate peasants still in the countryside. They want some kind of land redistribution. And so while Russia's growth rates economically, industrially, are in the late 19th century, Russia has come a long way industrially. Russia has come a long way in its treatment of peasants, but it hasn't come anywhere close to far enough. And the opposition of the czars to any kind of meaningful reform is going to set the stage for a revolution. So as long as the czars have their instruments of repression readily available, which would be the secret police and the army, then they don't have to really worry about revolution. This is what Russia's history tells us. They are able to suppress any kinds of uprising as long as they can get the military to the uprising fast enough. So the reason why there's a revolution in 1905 is not just the problems with industry and the problems in agriculture. It's also that the army is far away. was off fighting the Japanese in Manchuria, which left the Tsarist government vulnerable. And so you have kind of a convergence of forces. St. Petersburg, the capital, is one of the most industrialized of the Russian cities. And so that has left it packed with these poor workers who are aware of the shared suffering. Then you have a war which worsens those conditions. As the government needs more of those resources for its army, it causes the price of food to spike. And then the army's not there to put down the uprising. So when the Tsarist forces open fire on demonstrators in what was known as Bloody Sunday, it sparks a full-blown revolution. The Tsar at that point, Nicholas II, is able to prevent a more sweeping revolution by issuing a series of concessions. And the most significant of those concessions was the creation of a Duma, a national legislature. But the revolution of 1905 is, for legitimate reasons, seen as kind of a dry run for what's going to happen in 1917. Forces like the Marxists in Russia see the revolution in 1905 not so much as a failure as a missed opportunity. That the door was open for them to take over the country. And so Lenin, in particular, has determined that the next time this rolls around, he's not going to miss it. And so these revolutionary forces then are strengthened by the revolution of 1905 rather than satisfied or kind of dissipated by the revolution. The Duma, when it is created, the promise was that this would be a national legislature with real power. And then Nicholas II steadily reduces the influence of the Duma. And so that is a pattern that will go on until we reach 1917. The other thing that occurs after 1905 is that the Russians finally really push industrialization into full gear. And the Russian growth rates from 1905 to 1914 are similar to growth rates we see in countries like India and China today. They are just phenomenal. But the Russians stupidly get themselves involved in a total war before they're ready, and that's going to be the end of that. Because once again, the Tsar has sent away his instrument of repression, the army, in 1917, and cannot hold on to power.